This case, we're going to be looking at a controversial YouTuber. It's very hard to even reconstruct what occurred. Essentially, the YouTuber, as we are going to call him, because it's unclear even how to frame this. The controversy essentially began with the person making some remarks about fidelity in terms of, I'm not joking, in terms of breast size and how or whether a character's breast size should be portrayed accurately by a female actress. Now, I believe the relevant controversy was over Cowboy Bebop, an anime show which is being adapted. But it soon started to drift into other areas where IQ and race and behavior was brought up. It sounds really crazy, or what in the world is the connection between one and the other? But that is, I believe, what happened. And I'm trying to represent the YouTuber as fairly as possible. Of course, some went the maximum route of just calling the person a Nazi and leaving it at that. It's a very, very tough subject. So let me try to lay out very quickly the IQ controversy and then deal with the fidelity question and then make a judgment. Now, this controversy has been here for a while, probably in terms of the mainstream audience. The one that has made the most impact is The Bell Curve, a controversial book published by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein. Herrnstein was a psychologist and he contributed a lot to the book, but he died by the time the book was published. Murray is kind of notorious as someone who used to be a liberal but became more and more conservative. He had a book before this that was also very controversial called Losing Ground, Attacking Welfare Policies. But in The Bell Curve, he and Herrnstein basically predicted that the world would have a very rigid class structure based on IQ. And whatever you think about the data or the book, and I've read the book and I don't think it's a very good book, a lot of people noticed that in the footnotes and in the sources, and again, they weren't clear on this, they did not say this, they found that some of the sources were tied to a bunch of neo-Nazis and extremists and other very right-wing people. And I know the subject very well. I've studied the extreme right, Nazism, and all this for about 15 years. These were verified. And Murray has never to this day explained how these sources turned up, what was the point, who authorized it, was it him or Herrnstein? But these are real people, and they are genuine extremists. One of them is Willis Carto, who ran a magazine called The Mankind Quarterly that published articles recommending genocide. So he's a very big extremist, and the Mankind Quarterly is in the bell curve. It is cited. So the book itself proposed a very controversial thesis that used, to put it mildly, very extreme right-wing sources, and I think rightly has been dismissed by people who have tried to go through it analytically. But nevertheless, the myth that IQ determines our social reality has stuck, and Murray has continued to publish work on this. But as far as I know, the data is just very, very murky, and there's really not much that can be said about it. It's still a serious subject. It should be talked about. But in terms of IQ explaining things like income inequality or wealth status or things like that, we just don't really have any strong evidence. It just seems to be an interesting measure. But I am in the school that I don't think IQ is real. It doesn't seem to be a real thing. It's just a construct that's used in a lot of these articles and research, but we really don't know what it is. And nobody has been able to figure out what it is. And people keep claiming it's a real thing, but we don't seem to have any real independent evidence. It's just something that is a construct created by testing. So if you think the tests are reliable, you think IQ is real. But if you don't think the tests are reliable, then IQ is not real. And we've been stuck in that circle. Now, to get onto the, quote, breast controversy, I assume what the person is trying to say or do is two things. One is the fidelity argument, namely, if a character has big breasts, then the woman should have big breasts. The obvious case is Scarlett Johansson, who has, I would assume, a very generous bust size, and she can meet the dimensions of somebody like Black Widow, who also is usually depicted as having fairly large breasts, and so on and so forth. But of course, many times that's not going to be possible, and with Cowboy Bebop, it doesn't seem like it's possible, so they just went with an actress with, for lack of a better term, a normal breast size, and that's made a lot of people angry. But in terms of the subject that the, quote, YouTuber is bringing up, that's the same kind of insanity. I'll just use a simple case. Let's take a look at somebody like Heidi Klum. Heidi Klum has, I think, a pretty generous bust size, and she's a very rich woman. Now, if we follow this stupidity to its full Hitler logic, well, the reason Heidi Klum is very wealthy is because she's white. White people have high IQ. She's also a beautiful woman with big breasts. Well, therefore, correlate all these together, she's wealthy because she has a high IQ and big breasts. And that might seem like a promising thesis, but then several problems come in. Namely, and she also herself said this, that she actually didn't get as much work as you'd think. In fact, she only really had a big takeoff in her career in the mid 90s, but she had been modeling for a while. So basically, her look suddenly became very popular, and she started getting hired a lot. And she's definitely a very intelligent woman, right? She's one of the richest women in the world. But is it really correlated to her skin color and or her breast size? Well, that can't be right because somebody like Oprah has way more wealth. Is it then based on purely on breast size? Well, that can't be right because we can find women who have flat chests and make more money or even less money. And then we get right down to the ultimate thing about skin color or race. Well, that can't be right. To take a simple look, I think most people would concede Japan has an island full of people with very high IQs, but Japan fell into an economic depression in the 1990s. So again, the data is just very mixed and all over the place. I mean, you can try to do this, try to sort of be very clever and say it's just obvious that race and IQ are correlated, but it's like the correlation between breast size and income. Like, really, there isn't any. Does Bill Gates have enormous wealth because of his breast size? It doesn't make any sense. It's understandable that researchers, once they have a subject, have a vested interest in there being a correlation and there being a connection. But thus far with IQ or with breasts, trying to correlate it to some bigger social phenomena, we just don't have a lot of strong evidence. We don't have strong theories to support this. We just have a lot of correlations, statistical results, and maybe we can correlate one to the other, but it's a bit all over the place. So I believe in free speech. I think we should have any and all subjects discussed, but I'm not quite sure what this person is talking about or where they're coming from. They don't even cite any books or articles. It just seems to be a dogma that it's just obvious, right? IQ can be related to race. It's just obvious. And it's just obvious that women should have big breasts when they're playing certain characters. It's just obvious. Well, these don't seem to be obvious statements to me. They don't seem to be scientific statements. They just seem to be very ideological, dogmatic statements. And unfortunately, like it or not, they do kind of have a very Hitlerian bent, because I've studied the subject, and people who are usually obsessed with these kinds of questions in terms of IQ and race and eugenics, unfortunately, do often have a particular connection to the Nazi right, and that's where we are. Whether this person should be labeled Nazi, we're going to have to wait and see, but it's very disturbing that many people just now hold it to be just so obvious that we can make these very superficial observations on biology and then infer a whole lot of very questionable phenomena.